Welcome to another episode of This Is Why I Don't Vote, a podcast. Season 4, Episode 25. Your safe space to discuss sports, politics, social issues, and even religion, where we will take it all very seriously, but not too seriously. What's on tap? Another edition of Two Idiots Discuss Sports, the 2024 NBA playoffs. My buddy Jason comes on to break down the Celtics championship run. If you like what you hear, please like, subscribe, thumbs up, write a review if you haven't already. Send to friends far and wide. Please consider supporting the podcast. This Is Why I Don't Vote is on Patreon.
Act 1. Two Idiots Discuss Sports 2024 NBA Playoff Wrap-Up Edition.
Back on the podcast to help us break down the 2024 NBA playoffs, NBA superfan number one, Jason. Jason, say hello to the people.
Hello to the peoples.
We have exchanged texts over the course of these playoffs. Of course, you helped me invite these playoffs into the podcast, and I thought it would be fitting if we broke down our thoughts, our reflections on the 2024 NBA playoffs. I don't think that either one of us was surprised by the outcome, but certainly some of the series did throw us with regard to our predictions and with regard to how we thought some of these teams that were up and coming performed. So I'll start with this because I'm going to take a page out of something that you like to quote routinely because A, you like the man, B, you like the teams that he coached, and C, it is a quite astute observation. Pat Riley, from his autobiography, and I can't remember exactly how he put it, but basically pain and progression in a team actually being able to ascend and become a cohesive unit in order to win a championship. And this year, that team was certainly the Celtics. Would you not agree?
No, you nailed it too. It's the principle of pain and progression, which is what Riley saw in his own team when he took over the Lakers, and the Celtics really put it on them early in the 80s when Pat first took over. But where you really see it is the Detroit Pistons of the mid 80s to late 80s, where the Celtics kept killing them, but they kept coming back. They found new ways to kind of figure out what they were doing and eventually beat the Celtics. And there's that kind of iconic moment where you see Kevin McHale dapping up Isaiah Thomas and saying, hey, listen, don't be happy that you're there. Go win this fucking thing. And that's kind of an example of that. But Pat's book is great.
Well, and you could say the same thing for the Chicago Bulls, because the Bulls could not overcome the Pistons for those years leading up not only to the Pistons winning the championship, but that happened to coincide with the Bulls' ascension, and then they were able to slay the dragon, so to speak, and then they were the team of the 90s. So, looking at the Celtics, all of their failures over the course of the past 4 or 5 seasons, and seeing how even when they had those terrible games, one of the interesting asterisks next to the Celtics championship this year was the fact that they had a game in each one of their series that was reflective of who they were in all of those playoff series where they bowed out early. And instead of it being a defining characteristic or a trait of this team, it was just that one game. They had that one game against Cleveland. They had that one game against Indiana, right? And they were able to just shake it off, to remember who they were, to play the basketball that they knew they could play. And, the sum total of that was no one could beat them. And certainly no one was going to be able to beat them 4 out of 7 games. What were the things about this Celtics team that you noted that were so much different from the Celtics teams that everyone picked, or at least had as a possible NBA champion or NBA finalist, and continually fell short of that mark?
All right, so I'm going to say the principle of pain and progression again, because when you burn things, you learn things. Sorry, I've been watching cooking shows. It's okay. But one of the things that Brad Stevens has done, as when he moved into the front office and was used to be the coach, he made some radical moves. He traded Marcus Smart. He brought in Drew Holiday. Now, by the way, bringing in Drew Holiday is not a crazy move. And he brought in KP. Now, KP was not Porzingis, not kind of a linchpin of them winning, but he is to a certain extent based on what he did in that first quarter or the first half of game one. So that's a start.
Well, I think that is the start. You had two key players that came in on that team that were... Marcus Smart is not a bad basketball player, but Marcus Smart being a point guard and leading your team, he had the opportunity to lead that team to a championship. He just couldn't do it. You bring in Drew Holiday, a guy who has won an NBA championship at the very same position, and you've immediately made an upgrade. But I thought that there was a correlation between Bill Walton passing away and being the sixth man on what was probably the best Celtics team in the 80s, that 1986 team that unfortunately did not end up playing the Los Angeles Lakers. They played a very good Houston Rockets team. I don't want to take anything away from the Rockets, but I think that was the matchup everyone wanted to see, was whether or not that juggernaut Celtics team would have gotten revenge on the Lakers, and it just didn't happen. But Walton being a very important part of that 1986 team, and here you had Kristaps Porzingis, who his career has been in many respects just like Walton's career. When he's on the court and he's healthy, he's one of the best 10 players in the league. It's just that he's not on the court that often healthy, right?
No, I think this is right. That 8 minutes, maybe 12 minutes in game one, where you kind of see the thing, and I think Kevin Durant was the first person that called Kristaps the unicorn. 7'3" guy, great three-point shooter, good rim protector. He had kind of both of the things of a normal center that you would want, and also the things from a stretch five that you want. He just couldn't stay healthy. And then he kind of had that thing where he went to 3 or 4 different teams. It didn't work out with Luka. But there was 12 minutes there in that first game where he came off the bench. They didn't start him. And he scored 18 points in 13 minutes and blocked 3 shots. And I'm like, oh, that's the guy. That's the guy.
Yeah, I remember thinking to myself, I remember that guy when he played for New York. And that's who he was. He did that routinely in New York until he didn't, until I believe he has the same problems that Walton does, or Walton did, I apologize, his knees and his feet. He's almost too big to sustain that frame for an 82-game season for multiple seasons. I don't think he's a guy who's going to be able to play in the NBA for 60 or 70 games if you want him to be at his peak effectiveness. But the Celtics got exactly what they needed out of him, right?
No, agreed. You get what you want, we get what you need. That first game, he injected so much aggressiveness. He was hitting threes. He was blocking shots. It's almost like one of those things where you're like, hey, this is the first game. We're going to kill you. And then after that, maybe you get a little bit, but it's over. And I didn't think it was over, but it was just kind of cool that he came back like that. And by the way, if I can go back a couple steps, I hope he's more like an Ilgauskas who had feet and knee things, and he was never as dynamic as Porzingis. But he ended up having a 20-year career. And I hope that from KP.
I do too. I don't want to see him limited. It's just that that's how he's been so far in his career. And as you know, look, you and I know this, you get older and things just don't get better, right? You don't get healthier as you get older. You might start taking care of yourself better and you might be more conscientious about some of the things that you're doing. But generally, that's just to maintain. You're not actually getting ahead of the curve. So I'd like to say, hey, Kristaps in Boston, perfect marriage, and he's going to play 60 or 70 games off the bench. I'd love to see that happen. But the man didn't play 5 games in the NBA playoffs. He played in 1 game, and then he played, I believe, in another, and then he was absent for the other 3 games. So, he's always going to be facing these problems. But I don't want to get off too much on that tangent because it takes us away from the rest of the Celtics who, besides Porzingis and then Holiday, I mean, basically they've got 2 other all-stars on the floor at any given time, and you could argue that they've got 3, if not 4. So the team is stacked. I mean, the fact that they won the championship this year, if I had to pick a team next year to win the championship, it's the Celtics. I don't see anybody, at least at this point right now, that's heads and shoulders above everyone else on that same plane. Was there anything in any of the games that stood out to you? Let me rephrase that. I want to talk about Game 4. I'm not a Celtics homer. I don't watch the NBA like you. I watched that game out, so I was not at home. I was actually in a public place. You know this place. It's called Pomo. It's a great eatery. And I was noting that the Celtics were getting a bad call here. They were getting a bad call there. But, of course, you're in this bar atmosphere. You're eating. You're drinking. You may not be paying as much attention to the nuances of the game as you would be if you were just sitting at home. You were in what I'll call a vacuum or a captive audience. But the calls just appear to me to continue to pile up in ridiculousness against the Celtics, which, coupled by the fact that the Celtics couldn't even make a layup, led to that blowout. Do you see it the same way? Did you feel like the Mavs were getting these hometown calls, which when you add in the Celtics having their series typical game where they shit the bed, it just made for a farce of a basketball game?
So what I'm going to do is agree with both of the things you just said, before the comma and after the comma. Both of those things happened, right? The refereeing was not great. But to be fair, if the Celtics got a few more calls, they would have lost by 24 instead of opposed to 38.
Right. They couldn't make a layup.
They didn't show. They didn't show.
And they have that in them. I don't know what it is about that group of players that they have that in them, but they certainly do. And they showed it in every game of the series. I want to switch. I mean, we could go in and we could talk about the individual accolades for each one of the players on the Celtics. I would like to switch, though, instead and talk about one of the series that you and I texted one another over and over again about, because it was somewhat ridiculous, but maybe it's part and parcel with what you've just articulated, the principle of pain and progression, and that's the Indiana series. So Indiana versus Boston. Several of the choices that either the coach made, Rick Carlisle, who you would have expected, given his tenure in the NBA, some of the heartbreaking series that he's been a part of as a head coach, and then some of the decisions that the players made, pretty much a head scratcher as to how Indiana, not to say that they would have won the series had they made the right decisions, had the players made the right plays, but they certainly played themselves out of an opportunity to beat that team being Boston. So I want to talk about that, and namely, let's start with Halliburton and his baffling turnovers at the end of, forgive me, I believe it was Game 2, but it could have been Game 3. He's a young guy, right? He's going to make mistakes. But do you remember, in college or in the pros, a guy just dribbling the ball up the court, not even under pressure, and just basically dribbling it off his foot or losing focus such that he doesn't have a handle on his own dribble and he just turns the ball over in a 4 or a 2-point game.
So I do not remember this. I don't remember seeing it happen. I think it's a little odd. I think it's weird, specifically because Halliburton is one of the great kind of assist to turnover ratio guys.
Yeah,
he doesn't make a ton of mistakes, at least statistically. So that was weird for sure. But I think we saw that in some of the other series as well. And maybe it's youth, as Ben Affleck wrote in Chasing Amy, capricious youth, or Kevin Smith, sorry. It's just, you know what, when we're talking about Halliburton, I think he was hurt. I think he wasn't 100% there. And I think the moment was kind of his first moment.
Yeah.
When he was at Iowa State, they didn't make the Final Four. I think they made a 16. So this is his first, other than what is that thing? The in-season tournament.
Oh yeah.
It's his first thing.
Yeah.
He's going to be okay, so long as he's healthy.
Let's do this. Let's talk about Rick Carlisle not fouling up 3 in Game 3. You and I did exchange a number of texts over that, and the fact that he has a reputation. They went and looked at the math. They did the stats. And he's one of those coaches who just doesn't believe in fouling to put a guy at the line for 2 shots when you're up 3. He just doesn't do it. He ends up allowing the Celtics to move the ball around. They shoot a 3, they hit a 3, they win the game in overtime. What are your thoughts about not only what Carlisle did, but the whole debate, I guess you could call it, between you're up 3 with 5 seconds left, do you foul the guy and put him at the line for 2 shots, or do you let your defense play through it and see what happens?
So I think it's nuanced. How comfortable is the coach with the team that he has on the floor? Because there's a timing aspect of giving a foul. You have to make sure you're giving the foul early, and mostly in the NBA, once they've crossed half court, so they can't kind of set up their own shit. So there's 2 things going on. How early do you give the foul? And you want to make sure you're not fouling like a Peyton Pritchard where he's clearly going to take a 60-foot shot. And so I think there's the dimensions to it. How about that?
Well, I appreciate that. I feel like if you're up 3, that there are always opportunities to foul a guy unless they're going to throw the ball in from, because usually when you're talking about the NBA in particular, they're not bringing the ball up over half court. Generally, they've got a timeout. They've called that timeout. So they're taking the ball out of bounds over that half court line, and they're inbounding the ball. And generally, at the end of a game, in an NBA game, you're over your foul limit, so it's not as if you have fouls to give. So you can inbound the ball as an offense and expect that the person who's getting that inbound is going to be attacked and fouled immediately. So you could certainly shoot the ball as soon as you catch it, but generally that's going to be a terrible shot, because if you've got a coach that knows anything about defense, they're not going to allow you to inbound the ball anywhere near the basket. So you're going to be taking a long shot. So I appreciate that there are nuances there, but particular to the situation that the Celtics had, the Celtics inbound the ball over the half court line. They dribbled and then they passed and then they passed again. And that's when I believe it was Tatum who got that shot in the corner for 3 to tie the game. So there were opportunities for the Pacers to foul. They did not elect to do it because Carlisle is a don't foul guy. And I just thought it was I don't know what his record is at the end of games. I mean, that would be an interesting stat to look at. What is your record if you have the philosophy of I don't foul up 3 and to see how often you win versus how often you lose? He may have been well aware of his own stats that statistically, let's say it's 68%. 68% of the time, his teams win the game not fouling at the end, up 3, to put a guy on the line for 2. So he said, I'm going to play the numbers and let this thing play out. I have a hard time believing that it's going to be more wins than losses.
No, I think you're right. Without having looked into it. Yeah, I agree.
That was the Celtics and the Pacers. I want to briefly, and I think we're going to agree on all of this, I want to briefly talk about the Minnesota Timberwolves because they dispatched the Denver Nuggets. And even though that game went to 7 games, Denver looked like they were dragging in a number of the games. And I think you could make the argument that Denver looked like they were dragging against the Los Angeles Lakers, that many of the games that they were in when they were down, they did not look like a championship team. I mean, they had the wherewithal to come back against the Lakers, but that certainly wasn't a winning formula to carry throughout the course of the playoffs. And then comment on the Minnesota Timberwolves looking like they ran out of gas against the Dallas Mavericks. Is this just all a product? I mean, Denver, I think you could say they were tired. Their coach made a very astute observation after they were bounced by Minnesota about how much basketball they've played and the fact that they were exhausted. I bought that excuse. Do you?
You know what? I was just like flipping through my notes. Yes and no. And the no part of that answer, Patrick, is these are professional athletes. And they're not asked into May and June to perform every second day. They're asked to perform every third day.
Right.
And it stings me a little bit that if that's a thing, if that's something that people are talking about, then it makes me less kind of happy about what Denver did last year.
So expand on that. Why would their running out of gas in the playoffs this year tarnish in your mind their championship last year?
All right, so Nikola has 3 MVPs. He has 1 title. And I really don't want to do the first take thing or the sports radio take thing, but it's something to be considered. And I'll just leave that. I'll say it that way. It's something to be considered. He's really good. Go ahead.
Well, do you have that same kind of concern? Do you see that kind of corollary with Giannis, that he's also had MVP caliber seasons, and he only has 1 championship?
I don't. Can I tell you why?
Yes, please.
Because the closing game, he had 50 points, 14 rebounds, 5 block shots. It's one of the greatest. It's other than Magic's performance in 1979, where he had 45, 15 rebounds and 7 assists. Giannis's thing 2 years ago is the greatest closer performance in NBA history.
But he only has the 1 championship, right?
No, that's it. And if Dame doesn't come back in shape, he might have to go someplace else to get that other championship.
Let's talk about that rule. You're hinting at something that I'm going to ask about Denver. Now, I buy Denver's quote-unquote excuse, but let's look at two teams and their star players and the way those star players present. The first one being the Denver Nuggets, and we're talking about Jokic. And then we can talk about the second team being the Dallas Mavericks.
Luka?
Neither one of them presents as the most in-shape professional athlete you've ever seen, correct?
Oh, no, I sent you notes. No, not at all.
Jokic at least has won an MVP and a championship. And I don't think anyone would say he suffers from a lack of physical fitness, which presents at the end of crucial basketball games. I think Jokic played his ass off in the last 3 playoffs that Denver's been in, one of them resulting in a championship. They may need to get a little bit younger. There's some things that they could probably do to help Jokic. But when you look at Luka, it almost looks like a guy who, like Shaquille O'Neal, somewhat plays himself into shape over the course of the season and doesn't take his off seasons that seriously, and that inhibits what he can do, not just offensively, but defensively in games. Because he's not really a great defender. He puts most of his focus, his energy into his offense, and a guy who's not that in shape, you're not going to get anything on the defensive end. And that's just not winning basketball. Tell me I'm wrong.
I won't tell you you're wrong. Oddly enough, they're in the Minnesota series, Luka was kind of stout. He kind of he figured out a way, almost like doing drop coverage, but as a guard, which is weird. But listen, I've had this conversation with hundreds of people. They still list him at 6:30 or 2:30 on ESPN and some of the other outlets. He's every bit of 270.
Agreed.
And he's 6'7", and 270 wouldn't be bad for him if he were Karl Malone, but he's not. And I feel like the most actualized vision of him is kind of 250, somebody that could run cross country,
right,
and be fit in that way, and he's not.
One of the interesting things that I note when I'm watching these games with Luka in them, and the way the commentators address this, Luka backs a number of guys down that play that hybrid position that he plays. So he'll get the ball in the post, and he's not making a breakneck move towards the basket. He literally turns his back to the basket and just walks a guy down. And no one ever comments on the fact that he probably has 20, if not 30 pounds on the guy that he's backing down, who's playing a hybrid guard kind of small forward position. He's bigger than all of them. And it shows on the way he runs up and down the court and the way that he plays defense. He's just way too heavy. And I'm not sure how that's, I mean, is it like the situation in New Orleans with, what's his name, the guy from Duke, where they can't, no one in that organization can just sit him down and say, look, you're fat and you need to lose some weight. You can't be the guy who, as a leader of this team, doesn't come in to training camp in tip-top shape. You can't be that guy.
I think it's different from Zion because Zion hasn't actually performed in playoffs where our guy has.
Luka, yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's a little bit different there. And this may be, you tell me if I'm wrong. I think European maturity is different than American maturity.
No, I agree with this.
Is that a weird statement?
No, because I think the European game is so much different than the game in the U.S. And I don't think it's unique to Luka that you hear European players have to adjust to the way the American game is played, namely on the defensive end. I had watched the Bulls documentary on Netflix again. I think it was around the time you and I did the playoff preview. And I can remember specifically them talking about Kukoc, that when he actually got to Chicago, he demonstrated a number of offensive skills that really impressed people in the Bulls organization. But his defense was atrocious. And that was one of the main sticking points between him and Phil Jackson, was that Jackson couldn't believe how poorly he played defense playing at such a high level in Europe. But that... Go ahead.
Also Scotty.
Yes, Scotty was all over him. Now, of course, just for the listener that may not have a grasp of when that was, the timing, Michael Jordan had retired. Bringing Kukoc in was a boon to the Bulls team because he was such a talent, but Michael Jordan was one of the best players in the NBA, not only on the offensive end, but on the defensive end, and so was Scottie Pippen. And then they bring in this guy who's an offensive savant, and he's terrible on the defensive end, and half of it's effort. So you look at someone like Luka, you look at some of the other European players, they have to mature in understanding that their team is going to be limited by the fact that if they can't play any defense, it's 4-on-5 on the offensive end when they're on the defensive end.
Agreed, 100%.
So I want to delve into some of these other teams that we think are on that path of the principle of pain and progression. The first one I want to talk about is the Dallas Mavericks. Schadenfreude. Williams leaves Boston in a most inauspicious way, goes to New Jersey. That's a disaster. He bounces around the NBA. He ends up in Dallas. I did not know this until the finals, that he's gone back to Boston a slew of times, and he's never won there since he left. Were you aware of that?
We're talking about Grant Williams, the Tennessee guy?
No, we're talking about the other point guard on Dallas, Flat Earther.
Oh, yeah, Kyrie. Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. I said Williams. I just recognized that I did that. I'm not even going to edit that out of the podcast. Kyrie Irving leaves the Celtics and has not won in Boston since he did so. As far as Dallas being an up-and-coming team, having these two superstars in the backcourt, and they've got a lot of young talent. That Wiley kid, he's great. They made some really good moves, not only in free agency, but in the draft. Are they limited if Kyrie Irving can't go into Boston and win a basketball game?
Oh, they're limited anyway, because the new CBA has this thing where if you have like multiple max guys, you press up against what's called an apron, and it's kind of a tax apron. And Dallas is there. Boston is there. But Boston just won. So, if you just win a title, maybe you press up against it and do a little bit more so you can get kind of a dynasty.
Right.
But Dallas doesn't have that.
Right. They don't have they didn't get the win. I don't know that they can necessarily just stand pat considering how packed the West is. So that's interesting that they're going to be limited in the number of moves that they can make. And if they've got a guy, Boston's going to be there. Boston's going to be that juggernaut in the East. They have been for a few years. So if you plan on winning the NBA championship, even if you're a team in the West, you're going to probably need to not just gear up for the teams that you face out West. You've got to be able to figure out Boston. And you can't have your point guard shit the bed every time he goes into Boston. So
Agreed.
who else do we have in the West that I wanted? Oh, I wanted to talk about Minnesota. Is Minnesota on their way up, or are they a flash in the pan? Is Rudy Gobert on his... Was this season his siren song on being as effective as he is on defense? And can Minnesota win when you have a player in Carl Anthony Towns that there's no other way to say it. I hate using this word because I do think it's reductive and I think it's also kind of contrived. But he plays soft. Jimmy Butler wasn't wrong, was he?
Well, okay, so that last question was fun. Jimmy Butler wasn't wrong. But that team is very well constructed. I actually think that what Karl Anthony Towns is doing is it makes sense in the current construction of what the NBA is.
You don't think he needs to play next to the basket more often?
No, I don't. As a matter of fact, he's not good at it.
See, this is where I disagree. He had several series against Denver and then against Dallas that when he played down low and attacked the basket, he was effective at drawing fouls, at scoring buckets, and making the defense collapse. And I think it is a waste of his talent to play as far away from the basket as he does, as frequently as he does, particularly when he's not shooting the three well. I mean, I could transition to a number of teams, like Indiana is going to be next, if we're talking about just being confused as to what you can do, not when the ball isn't going in the basket. But Karl Anthony Towns, he's not in the role, in the position where if his three isn't going down, he can shoot through it. I mean, he had several games where he shot in the high teens or the low 20s from three, and I would look at the stat line, I was like, wait a minute, he shot 14 threes. He shot 14 threes, and he made 2 of them. That team can't win if your center, I mean, I know you might call him a forward now in this modern NBA, but if your center is shooting 14 threes and only making 2 of them.
So what would you do with Rudy?
Well, I think they need to play more like some of the teams that have been effective with 2 big men. Look at San Antonio. I see you, San Antonio, with the Admiral and your boy.
You mean my boy, Tim Duncan?
Tim Duncan.
The 7th best player in the history of the league.
Well, but let's look at then the team that I mentioned earlier, the Houston Rockets, when they had the Dream, Hakeem Olajuwon, and Ralph Sampson on the floor. There's ways that you can play 2 big men on offense, particularly where Rudy Gobert, look, Karl Anthony Towns, I think, has the athleticism to play around the basket and to do it effectively. He just hasn't focused on that part of his game. Rudy Gobert has never demonstrated a soft touch or a deft foot around the basket. So he's much less the threat that Karl Anthony Towns is. So I would play Rudy Gobert and Karl Anthony Towns at the same time. You can play Karl Anthony Towns out on the wing if you want, but what you need to do then is to give him more isolation so that he can make a choice. He can be more like Joker. He can be more like Jokic. He can shoot if he wants to shoot. He can back a guy down, and he can create such that when he's in his rhythm, he can pass out of a single wing situation, or if he's getting doubled, he can throw the ball out of it. But at least when you put him out on the wing and a defender's on him, you aren't convinced that he's either going to shoot a 3 or he's going to do a dribble drive and shoot a 14-footer. a 12-footer. He at least can go to the basket, and then you've got someone like Gobert that can crash the basket and get the offensive rebound and put the ball in, right? I mean, is this a crazy scenario for modern basketball simply because so many teams are shooting threes?
Not only is it not crazy, I actually think there are teams that are close to my heart should kind of do this, but at least initially, but whatever.
They're not going to do it because Karl Anthony Towns isn't going to participate. I mean, he's proven that he's going to play his game the way he's going to play his game. So you're going to have to coach to that. And
yeah, but we're going to get Sar.
Hey, in a league where the stars run the show, he's going to be fine. I just don't see them winning a championship. I think Towns is going to be the problem until he's not. On the other end of the spectrum, you've got the Indiana Pacers, who I discounted at the beginning of the playoffs in our preview. They proved me wrong in two ways. One, they can shoot. And not only can they shoot, but when they get into that rhythm of shooting, I mean, they reminded me this year of Golden State in several of their playoff series over the course of the last few years, where when they start shooting well, like they just get you in such a hole that it doesn't seem like you can dig yourself out. It's amazing a team is going to be shooting 60 or 70% for a half, but Indiana did it several times. They did demonstrate, though, that when those games are close, when it's a 2-point game, they don't know how to win yet. Do you think Rick Carlisle is the coach to allow them to grow into that experience, that winning team, or will it be a situation where by the time this team matures well enough that they can win, Carlisle's going to be gone?
They're almost up. Carlisle will be gone. And, JJ will be gone.
JJ Redick?
Am I right? Yes. Am I wrong about this?
No, I was going to get, that was going to be my conclusion.
3 years.
Yeah, that's going to be, well, you know what, let's do it. I mean, we're so far into this. JJ Redick was an interesting hire. I mean, certainly that was you asking the girl of your dreams to prom and having her consider it and then turn you down and then having to go with your second choice. I don't know that JJ Redick is necessarily a terrible choice, but he's going into a terrible situation for someone who's never coached a basketball game. And that's what I think is JJ Redick can't say no. The money is right. And so it's not unfair in that sense, but it's unfair in the sense that you're putting a guy who's never coached a basketball game into an almost untenable situation. Where do you see this going? Do you think he's going to last 2 seasons or more, 2 seasons or less, or he's not even going to make it through 1 season?
I think 3, actually.
Okay, so he may coach beyond LeBron James. LeBron may be gone from LA and he's still going to be there?
No, not at all. I think it's possible that the Lakers organization has said, hey, we're doing this. And we're going to let the chips fall where they may. In
letting the chips fall where they may, where does that leave? Does that mean LeBron's going to say, okay, I'm going to stay for this?
No.
So is it possible then, if LeBron's not going to stay, that JJ's not going to make it 3 years?
No, actually, I think it's probably he's going to make it 10 years. I think he's Spo.
Really?
Yes.
That good?
No, I don't think he's that good. But I think the Lakers think he's that good.
If I'm hearing what you're saying correctly, this could be a Matt Millen situation, that they so fall in love with the person that they'll make excuses for some of their deficiencies, particularly in the win-loss column?
That was not what I was going for, but I think you're right.
Because there are people in that organization that seem to love him. I don't think that Jeannie Buss is one of them. And the scuttlebutt that I read was that Anthony Davis really wanted him there, and that helped move the needle for Jeannie Buss. So if Anthony Davis is going to be a longtime Laker, perhaps you're right. LeBron may move on and they get some new players and they make a run. And if he has a Spoelstra type playoff run or two in him, that he gets to stick around for a while. Well, Jason, I appreciate you coming on the podcast. It's always good to talk to you, to pick your NBA brain, your knowledge. I don't know that we got to all of your notes, but I do look forward to doing this again when they open up the camps, getting ready for the next season.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Well, I'll talk to you again. If there isn't something strange and amazing that happens for football, we'll certainly do this again in October.
Be well, sir.
Act 2, Epilogue.
The sports gods have looked kindly upon the podcast. The NBA championship finished. I thought that the NHL playoffs were going to be, the Stanley Cup was going to be finished as well. And here are the Edmonton Oilers winning 3 straight. So I can have my buddy John on and we can do a NHL Stanley Cup breakdown, hopefully next week. Perhaps discussing one of the greatest comebacks in the history of modern sport, the Edmonton Oilers coming back from 3-0 down to win the Stanley Cup. This is Why Don't Vote, a podcast.